Okay, Jesus said in Matthew 5:19, do and teach God's law. This is God's law number 48, welfare and law. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jim McCotter. Here's God's law number 48 from God's law book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 24 and 25. Quote, you may eat your fill of the grapes from another man's vineyard, but do not take any away in a container. It is the same with someone else's grain. You may eat a few with your hand, but don't use a sickle. End quote. God's law did not have tax laws to funnel money through bureaucracies to dole out to a permanent dependent class. But God's law allowed for a hungry person to get a handful of grapes from a vineyard or a handful of grain from a field. This is one part of God's form of welfare, quote unquote. No one could just sit on a sidewalk waiting for someone to give them a free handout. This would virtually have no ill effect on a farmer's profit and by far be more preferable than onerous government taxes going to bureaucrats to siphon off money doling out to the destruction and perpetuation of a poor class. But God cares for the poor, and this is one of the ways to provide for them. The other ways will be looked at when we get to God's, quote, tax, quote, laws. Jesus was following this, quote, welfare, quote, law with his disciples when the Pharisees condemned him in Mark 2:23 through 35, quote, one Sabbath day as Jesus was passing through the grain fields, his disciples picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? The days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions, end quote. Then he said to them, quote, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, end quote. The Pharisees were not condemning Jesus because his disciples were picking grain while passing through the grain field, but because they did it on the Sabbath. Jesus was following this law in Deuteronomy, but the Pharisees condemned him for breaking the Sabbath law. Here Jesus revealed two major truths. One, the benefit and purpose of God's law. And two, the deity of the Son of Man. Jesus reveals the Sabbath law was made for the benefit of man. Thus, Jesus reveals that God's law was made for the benefit of man, not the other way around. How foolish those Christians who think being saved is to ignore or even reject God's law, when Jesus said it is for our benefit. But remember, there are two parts to God's law. First, God's ceremonial law, and second, God's moral law. God's ceremonial law is that part of the law that was the sacrificial and pictorial laws. They were all exclusively fulfilled with Jesus when he came the first time. God's moral law is all the rest of God's law, the Ten Commandments, the statutes, and the judgments. God's moral law is for the benefit of man today, for every individual person to obey and every single nation to obey as civil law. This is the only law that God has given. It is the only, quote, perfect law, Psalms 19:7 and James 1, verse 25. It's the only, quote, eternal law, Psalms 119, verse 89 and 160. It's the only law Jesus lived by, Matthew 5:17 and 18. It's the only law Jesus will rule nations when he returns, Isaiah 2 through 5 and 9, 6 through 7. It's the only law the apostles were declaring for all nations to obey, Acts 17, 6 and 7. It's the only law all Christians today should be teaching all nations to obey, Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Proverbs 28:4 says, quote, to reject God's law is to praise the wicked, To obey God's law is to fight them.